Galimera, Galispera, Galinichta. No matter where in this wild, wacky, and sometimes wonderful world you might be, thank you for making the Highbury Squad part of your day. We are back after 2 days of going dark, just like Broadway. But what has happened since the last time we spoke? Let's catch up, squaddies. We've got a great guest today, and we have some housekeeping items to take care of too.
Mind the gap between the train and the platform. Please stand clear of the discussion doors. The next stop is Highbury Squad.
Hola, hola, at ease, squaddies, at ease. Welcome back to Squad Central. I'm going to try and be better at scheduling, I have to admit. I've been going with when my guests can go, but sometimes that also affects when listeners expect to hear shows. So first off, I'm going to say I'm going to try and be better than that, but also sometimes when you have certain guests, you want to just plug and play, cut and paste, keep rolling, keep going. And many of you do catch up on replay. So those who are listening on replay tonight, thank you so much. For those listening on iTunes, thank you so much. You can catch all the latest episodes on there. And I have a big announcement to make, but I'm not going to be able to make it until Friday probably. But it's very exciting for the channel, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. Ben Jacobs is running a little late and will be here a little 10 past the hour. And you know what's going to happen to Ben Jacobs? I mean, incoming yellow. Can't be late. Can't be late for Squad Central. You know why? Because Super Kev was never late, ever late. And you can ask James Johnston how that went once for him too. So good evening to each and every one of you. We're going to get stuck into some good stuff. Tammy Steels, squaddies, please remember to hit the like button. Scott says, if Gabriel goes, then do be it. As long as we get a hefty amount for him, fit him. I'm actually spell checking and editing for you, Scott, as we go. Mike, keep Gabi at all costs. He's captain from the back. A metronome, a beast. I agree. I am very against this. Mikey says if we get 80 to 90 million for him, it would take the sting out of it. But who are we recruiting to replace him at a similar level? Mikey, you're talking my language. Absolutely. We're going to get stuck into it with Ben when he's here in about 6-7 minutes or so. Carol, good evening to you. PW, Galispera to you. Trev, good evening to all the squaddies in the house. Just popping in to hit the like button. He's up, you see, Trev just pops in just to hit the like button and then he listens afterwards. I love that. It's perfect. Absolutely perfect. Donna Potts, good evening to you as well. Good morning, no matter where in this wild, wacky, and sometimes wonderful world you might be. Speaking of Donna Potts, let's tell you the agenda for the rest of the week. All right. So now I'm giving you fair warning, squaddies. I sprung today's show on you last minute, and but tomorrow at the same time, 5 p.m. UK time, we've got Harry Symeou back in the studio to re-examine our SWOT analysis, our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, Andrea Berta has arrived at the club. Has an actual official announcement gone out yet? I don't even know if I've seen one. Well, as far as we know, Berta has joined the club. So we're going to dig into our SWOT analysis with Harry. Remember, 2 or 3 months ago, Harry popped in and we did the SWOT analysis. We also did one with Askblog. So I'm going to do a cross analysis, and we're going to get stuck into what has changed and what's coming, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats-wise with Harry tomorrow. So you're not going to want to miss that. And on Friday, we're going to end the week with a little bit of fun and also some seriousness. It's episode 5 of season 2 of Get Off the Potsy. So you're not going to want to miss this, as we're trying to renegotiate contracts for Saka, for Big Gabi, for Saliba. And also we're looking ahead to the summer transfer market. Potsy is going to be back in studio at 4 p.m. UK time. That's 4 p.m. UK time. Check the community page. I announced all of this morning. And I need your help with this one too. So usually Potsy comes in and he does his top 5 talking points. And then at the end, he singles out someone to get off the Potsy. What we're going to do is we are going to play Director of Football on Friday. So we're going to take the Arsenal's summer transfer budget. We don't know how much that is. We're assuming it's going to be around 150 million. I'd say that. 200 million. And we're going to play Director of Football. What are we going to do with that money? And we're all going to do it together with Potsy. And how are we going to spend it? How are we going to also maneuver around wanting to spend more? I.e., are you going to keep Martinelli? Are you going to keep Trossard? Are you going to sell Gabriel, Big Gabi to the Saudis? How are we going to manipulate and also master the budget when it comes to the summer transfer window? So Potsy will be in on Friday for that. And that will be fun as well. Mark needs a new barbecue. Well, I know it's an unexpected pleasure. I know. I sprung it on everyone. This is how it goes. I was supposed to do a Monday show and yesterday. But you know what? Sometimes you've got to take care of yourself. So I've been doing this whole... In America, when you take care of your car, you call it a smog test. In England, you call it an MOT. So I have been doing a Sophie MOT. So I've been going for all sorts. Listen, I'm of age, all right? We talk honestly here. I'm getting older. So when you get older, you got to do things. You got to take care of your body. And just like I go at a certain time because my great guests can make it, I have to go at a certain time when great doctors can make it, right? And so I've been doing I've been having an MOT. I even did a brain scan. It's kind of fun, actually. It's kind of cool. It's actually really good and reassuring to know what's going on with your body. And I know men go through aging and men go through certain things, but the female body really... Does anyone really want to talk about this? Those tuning in to talk about Gabriel going to Saudi Arabia, surprise! It's the perimenopausal show. All I'm saying is it's been good to go and get a full MOT, right? So... brain, lungs, especially after what happened to my mom, spine, stuff, heart, all of it. So I've been doing that. And that's why I wasn't with you on Monday and on Tuesday as well. I tell you, I had a spine thing, neck thing. I'm going to a neurologist. I mean, that's cool. I mean, and I have to say, by the way, I know people have an issue with Elon Musk right now, but seeing the rescue of those astronauts in space and, physics and astroscience, whatever they call it, astrodynamics. What am I getting this right, Tony? Astrodynamics, going to space. Like, there are so many smart people in this world that do amazing things. And it never ceases to amaze me, like doctors and specialists and all this type of stuff. Like when I saw that rocket land and they landed it like the way Bergkamp used to land the pass to Thierry Henry, I was like, wow, this is absolutely unbelievable. How are they doing this? They're so bloody clever. And I'm just really grateful. By the way, did I tell you that my doctor is an Arsenal fan? So this gets tricky. You want to talk about this real quick as we mention as we wait for Ben Jacobs to arrive? So it turns out my GP, I may have told you this before, but my doctor is an Arsenal fan. And listen to this. He listens to the show. So I'm just saying, and it gets a little shy when you got to go in and talk about stuff with your doctor, who's a gooner and who listens to your show. How do you manage that one? Hello, doctor. I have a By the way, do you really think that rice is a 6 or an 8? I don't know, but can we just finish up here? I digress just a little bit. Right. Yes, by the way, we are going to resolve the issue with Newman once and for all on Friday with Potsy in the house. I have received new artwork, and Newman claims it to be his greatest piece yet. And he said, this is my final attempt. And I said, well, it's the final finding, dude. It's not your final attempt. It's the final finding as to whether or not you are going to receive one of these delicious coins. And he sent me a new piece of art, and he claims it to be his greatest ever. So we're going to examine that together, and we're going to finally, you're not going to want to miss Friday's show. Number one, it's with Potsy. And number two, I couldn't think of a better person to make this final decision with. I was going to take it to the board again, but I don't think we have time for that anymore. Everyone's spoken. So we're just going to move ahead, and we're going to make a final decision on Newman and whether or not he's going to be getting a coin. Ian, no official announcement yet, but rumors are he's already been at Colney when Josh Kroenke was in town. Who are you talking about? Price of me becoming a sporting director. Mark, I would trust the money with you. I totally would. Donna, unexpected pleasure. Just did you, Mark? Tammy says she had a medical yesterday. Got to monitor my blood pressure over the weekend. You know what? It's good. Think about it. When there's something wrong with your car, you take it to the mechanic right away. You get it fixed. Oh, man. Smells, engine smells. Why is there a light on? You know, you go get it done. And sometimes we ignore signals that are sent directly to ourselves, right? So you've got to get things checked out. Don't wait. Absolutely don't. You know, if you got a niggle here and niggle there, you got to go get it sorted out. Hello, William, to you. Did you not have the doctor on a show once? Not my doctor. Yeah, not my doctor. Mohammed says, no way, Big Gabi going to Saudi. I hope this is true. No, his name is not Dr. Newman, Mark. So hope he hits the likes. He does. He definitely does, the old doctor. Charles Watts book. You guys are really examining the background, huh? Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Can you name the other book underneath Charles Watts? If you can, then I'll send you the book. How about that? Let's see. Thanks. So I've promised not to buy any more left backs. Yeah. Okay. All right. Enough about my doctor. Enough about me going and getting an MOT. Enough about Newman and his pathetic art. Although you guys may think it's a masterpiece. Let's get stuck in. It is the wonderful Ben Jacobs joining the show. Ben, welcome back to Squad Central.
Thanks so much for having me. You can tell I'm late when you have to go into the depths of book covers and MOTs. Expert filling.
I do have to be consistent, Ben. It's happened to Warren Barton. It's happened to David Ornstein. And here you are. It's a yellow card for your lateness. It's going to go to VAR, but I'm sure that VAR will back up the decision. But jokes aside, Ben Jacobs from Give Me Sport and also commentating now on TalkSport as well, which is fun. Are you enjoying that?
Love it on TalkSport. Yeah, I do a Premier League commentary each week for the international feed. I've got a slightly rare, it might be a world's first title of Saudi Pro League correspondent with TalkSport. And then I cover various transfer news as well. But I can't think of anybody else in the world, certainly outside of Saudi Arabia, that has that title. So TalkSport breaking ground because they kind of preempted in 2023 the Saudi market would go crazy. And obviously I've lived out there in Qatar, in the UAE, and a brief time in Saudi as well. And now I have the title as well.
Wow, look at you. You're going places. I've been to Qatar a few times. My brother works out there and commutes from Qatar to Cyprus. And yeah, at first for me, it kind of felt a little strange and weird, but I think we live in a world now where there's a lot going on, and I don't want to get into those nooks and crannies, but what I do want to get into with you, by the way, when you posted about Gabrielle, there was someone that challenged you on it, and I loved how you scored them on all the exclusives that you've had with the Saudi League. So let's just take it a step back a little bit, Ben, with how people kind of were comparing the Saudi league. Before we get to Gabriel, I just want to make our listeners understand exactly where this league stands right now. When it first came up, everyone was like, oh, this is another China league. And then I was like, these are deeper pockets. And also, this is a culture that does not accept failure. So talk to me a little bit about how the mania of the Ronaldo and the Benzema times and the progression of the league and where it's at now and the seriousness behind it. I also saw that you posted, I think, was there a chairman who stepped down or is stepping across? And can you talk us through that a little bit for education before we get stuck into Gabriel and what it means to Arsenal?
Yeah, I mean, the short version of the story is the Saudi Pro League and wider projects connected to the 2034 World Cup have an ambition that's sky high and an infrastructure that's still growing. And it will take time for the infrastructure to kind of catch up with the ambition. But naturally, because Saudi have this so-called Vision 2030, which sets out various government goals, and sport is one of them, and because they have a 2034 World Cup, the project is going to evolve between now and first 2030 and then 2034. So it's very easy to look at the first real summer of money and stars and say, since then, it's gone a bit quiet. But naturally, you have to think more about a decade or so long plan and where the league is going to be eventually. And if I think about the Premier League 92, 93, it was maybe 98, 99 where we started to see Dennis Bergkamp's, Gianfranco Zola's, Jurgen Klinsmann's. And then by the time maybe we were in the early 2000s, we were much more blasé about it's international. We expect the top stars, but that certainly wasn't the case in 92, 93. And maybe when the Premier League first launched, if somebody had said within 5 to 7 years, it would be predominantly the creme de la creme of elite footballers, certainly from Europe, many would have batted their eyelids and said, how's it going to get there? Who's going to fund it? And how are the clubs going to benefit? And Saudi's kind of going through that journey right now. The only real difference is that there is a quota for foreign players, much like China. So eventually, regardless of who they sign and how many, the individual clubs will have their quotas full, at which point there'll be a blend between Saudi talent and the domestic market and international stars. And of course, a truly global elite league will be a meritocracy. And if Saudi Arabia, for the benefit of the World Cup and their local talents development, continue with this cap on foreigners, then the league, probably compared to the Premier League or Europe's Big Five, will have a hurdle to overcome. And either the Saudi talent will have to improve or they'll have to dine off the foreign stars they've got, but they won't be of the same volume because of the foreign quota as the other leagues. And I suppose Saudi's perspective is they're not there yet. So they're just trying to raise the local standard, raise the amount of foreigners, lower the average age of the foreigners so they arrive at peak age, not in their mid-30s, get a television audience, get a global buzz around the league. And goal number one between now and 2030 is make this league, if we're talking strictly coefficient, within the top 10 in the world. By the World Cup, they want it to be in the top 5 in the world. And then after the World Cup, who knows? I suppose the dream is, can it rival the Premier League? And the reality is it's late games, it's a hot climate. There could be an exodus after the World Cup. But when people compare it to China, there is one big difference. And that is Saudi Arabia has got a crazy and defined football culture that we saw when they beat Argentina at Qatar 2022. And I've been over to derbies, and I know people will be shouting into their laptops or TV screens and saying, but wasn't there like 400 people that watched Jordan Henderson play? And again, that's a challenge because there's a lot of newer teams, developing teams that are really small, probably League One, League Two in terms of their infrastructure. But if you look at the big teams, which are 4 that are owned by PIF, including Ronaldo's Al Nassr, Al Qadsiya, which has got Aramco money, Neom, which is developing and will have a lot of money, and 1 or 2 others coming through. These are the big teams playing in huge stadiums. And I've been over there to derbies, like the Jeddah derby, and there was nearly 70,000 people there. And it was an incredible atmosphere, up with any other derby that I've seen. So I think that's why I think the Saudis are confident this project can work, because they start with a much more defined football culture than in China.
Lot to unpack and digest there as well. And I want to I try to avoid certain conversations on the show that, I want to be all inclusive, and there's certain things I think that bother the listeners and bother me. And then at the same time, I kind of look at a lot of things that are going on around the world. And if we made a list of things we should boycott, I think the list would be endless. But I did want to touch on, I know you've lived the culture. I've been there as a gay woman. And of course, I think the resistance for some fans is the history, the treatment overall. Do you feel that the biggest hurdle for them is the cultural element? Ben, do you think there's some people that talk about this as sports washing. There are some people that talk about this as no, they've got Formula One, they've got the boxing, they've got UFC. We're talking about football now. They've lured Ronaldo there. I've seen MLS try to grow in similar fashion, the way you talked about, aging and youth development and TV deals and being ready for a World Cup in 2026 for the US. How do you, you've lived there, you've been there. What do you think about the kind of moral side of it all versus the reality of what's happening and that it's going to continue to happen, and somehow, some way, people need to find a way to accept that money talks?
Yeah, we'd be entirely naive and we wouldn't be doing our jobs as journalists if we simply said, but the sport is great, let's ignore the bigger picture. And there's a connection always between bringing something international to a place like Saudi Arabia. It was the same with Qatar as well. And understanding that that will be a form of soft power or sports washing, or as Saudi would put it, part of their sports strategy to promote tourism. And it can simultaneously, of course, be both, because there can be a political element to it that comes under scrutiny. We know with Saudi Arabia, when FIFA somehow scored the human rights risk as medium, there were a lot of human rights organizations that said, how, if you're scoring it medium, could there possibly be any country in the world that scores high? What criteria would be necessary to get it to turn from orange to red in FIFA's eyes? And I think in the build-up between now and the World Cup, we'll have that limelight, and we'll hear a number of different perspectives. And I think all really those in sport for Saudi Arabia ask is that people that have a passion for the sport visit and make their mind up. And if you visit and you don't feel included, if you visit and you can't do what you want to do, if you visit and you don't like the fact that you can't drink, if you visit and you don't think the tourism's that great, if you visit and you think it's all a sham, if you visit and you think that the sport would be of a better standard if it was elsewhere, then you leave and you say, okay. And having lived in the UAE and Qatar and been to Saudi many times, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then I've gone home, whether I'm hypercritical or whether I'm more generous in my conclusions, because I've met and spoken to people firsthand, and I've picked up pieces that attack a World Cup or a country. And I think the way it's presented is clearly written by somebody that hasn't been there. And Qatar was a good example with climate, for example, where constantly people said, yikes, how can you do it in the summer? And I know it got moved to the winter, but I'd been inside the stadiums with the technology and I was freezing in the summer because the technology was so effective. Then I heard if it's in winter, somehow it will still be dangerous. And winter's freezing in Qatar. Everyone's walking around in jumpers as well. So there's a few misconceptions out there, but I understand how somebody that hasn't visited will look at the bigger picture outside of sport and say, this is really just about sports washing or whitewashing. And they are uncomfortable with that because they feel that something that's dear to them, that they love, that they define in a different way in terms of how the sport should be presented and how the affiliated culture that comes with it comes. And they say, is it not just being warped? And is it not being changed less because the country is deserving and more because the country has got enough money to just pull everything into its own bubble. And then when it's there, the more that comes, the more nonchalant we become, because you attack the World Cup and people will just turn around and say, well, where were you shouting and screaming about when the boxing was there, the snooker was there, the darts was there, the Formula One was there? And eventually it can become so normalized that you lose the ability to use sport anymore as a means to question the bigger picture. And one example of this is when I went over there, I did a year-long investigation on Be Out Q, a pirate network run from Saudi Arabia despite government denials, that was ripping off everything from beIN Sports in Qatar due to politics, all the way through to BBC and ESPN. And you had like La Liga and the Premier League and many others, even Gianni Infantino at one point saying piracy must stop. And then flash forward 6-7 months or whatever, politics is removed and Javier Tebas is suddenly opening an office in Saudi Arabia, and Gianni Infantino is beckoning in a World Cup era after the centenary that obviously has Saudi Arabia as a centerpiece. So you see a lot of U-turns. And I suppose if we're cynical, we need to question them. But the simpler logic is, if at least you go over there and decide for yourself, then if you still think it's all a bunch of sports washing, that's an opinion that even those in Saudi Arabia will respect. But if you're sort of aiming attacks from a distance with no idea about what the locals think, with no idea what the climate's really like, with no idea that there's plenty of European people that are fiercely fighting for better change in Saudi Arabia, then you're going to have a warped perception. So that's why I go over there regularly, not to implicitly be positive about Saudi Arabia, because that's not what journalism is. And I've written enough negative stuff and investigations about that part of the world. But I do think it's important that you go and meet all sides to come up with a balanced conclusion of what you think Saudi Arabia is actually like and what you think it's trying to become, rather than just assuming that it's 100% bad in every area and therefore refusing to engage with it and walking away with less of a comprehension as a result.
And I really respect and appreciate everything that you have said. And I really also very much appreciate that you're willing to have the conversation with me about, you know, where our listeners are talking about human rights. And it's interesting because, you know, as a gay woman, I can't go to Saudi Arabia or be myself. I've been to Qatar, but I have to hide who I am because there's ramifications and consequences. And yet I was born in London and in a country where we accept all cultures, all behaviors, to the point where sometimes maybe we sacrifice our own identity as a nation in order to be kind of the good humans that we are, to welcome everybody. So from a personal perspective, I respect the fact that the game is growing, and I respect that, you know, there's a monetization to the game now that nobody has control over. Whether I said I respect that, but I understand it. As the person that I am, and like I said, my brother lives in Qatar, and you know, I've go there when I fly to Cyprus. It's a connecting flight for me. But there's always this kind of feeling of I must be. And can I be honest, Ben? Like I grew my hair out before I went there because I didn't want to look gay. Right? I always had this haircut where, you know, I've got my shaved side and I like a funky fro and a you know, a flow hawk and stuff like that. And I felt like I needed to either wear a hat, or I'm like, how can I look less gay? Right. And I interviewed a couple of people from Qatar before the World Cup, and there's this undertone of, you know, and we saw what happened with Grant Wall and people that were trying to wear the rainbow flag. It's not just about that. It's about drinking. It's about the culture. It's about the World Cup in Saudi Arabia. You will not be able to get a drink anywhere. And I guess my issue is, as an immigrant Greek born in London, now moved to the United States, it's you accept our culture. We have to accept your culture in our own country. And I don't want to get too deep about it, But I think these are genuine concerns that people have about the inequality of the acceptance of you have to do what we say when you're here, but we can do what we want when we're there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it does make sense. And I think everybody will have their own reservations about potentially going to Saudi Arabia, and some will fly over there, and as they did with Qatar, they'll leave and they'll think, wow, it was nothing like what I expected and I really enjoyed it. Other people will say, I felt uncomfortable throughout the whole visit. Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, won't check a passport for religion. It won't ask about sexuality. But as you rightly say, some people want to dress a certain way, express themselves a certain way, and they won't be able to. And that's as simple as you can't be walking around, even if it's 40-degree heat, showing a bunch of flesh. You can't show too much public affection as any kind of couple, regardless of sexuality. But it's not quite the deterrence that people fear. So even when I was in Dubai, which is 99.9% Western, and there's alcohol everywhere, you see a lot of scaremongering in the papers. But when you actually dig into the stories, you find that those that had severe punishments, such as being detained or deported, they were maybe warned and warned and warned and warned. There was a very famous story, probably 2011, about sex on the beach in Dubai, and it happened at a very Western bar.
I remember that story.
The couple were seen as victims, but I think it's fair to say in most countries, if you have sex in public, you're going to get stopped. And I think they were warned and warned and warned and warned and warned by, first of all, other hotel goers, then hotel staff, then politely by the manager. And they just kept coming out of the sea and then going back in again. And then eventually it was a case of the security guard and then finally the police. And I think that would have happened in almost any country. So there's definitely scaremongering. But the reality is that nobody, Saudi Arabia, government, journalists, nobody has the right to tell you how you think or who you are or how you want to express yourself. And if you, for whatever reason, whether it's sexuality, religion, simply the fact that you want to dress a certain way, act a certain way, drink a certain way, if you're not comfortable with it, then educate yourself to make sure that your notion of what it's like matches the reality. And if in your mind it does, having been informed, then absolutely don't go. And if a lot of people feel that they don't want to go, then of course there's an argument that deserves coverage in the media landscape that says, is it actually as inclusive as it says it's going to be? And I've got every sympathy. The only caveat I would say, and it's not in any way an excuse for Saudi Arabia or Qatar or anybody else, but we're constantly focusing the limelight when a big sport event comes around all these issues, and rightly so, because there's no point in having these tournaments if they also don't prompt a debate and ultimately put pressure on the countries that are staging them if they've got questionable pasts and records to make change. But at the same time, coming back to your point, there'll also be gay people, for example, that are not comfortable walking into a UK stadium with a rainbow flag or holding their partner's hand. And I've got many friends that will also change the way that they look or dress or present themselves walking into any sports stadium around the world, because they are just as reticent about what if the person behind me has abuse. So we need to make sure that we work on the big picture, of course, and Saudi Arabia is a very logical and easy target. But with all of these issues, we need to look at every country and every sport.
We have issues in our own.
We're inclusive at grassroots level too.
Yeah, we have issues in our own country, and you're absolutely right. And a couple of our listeners are talking about, there's issues across the world. By the way, I don't like flying flags. I'm actually quite like low key. And all that type of stuff. But what I did when I moved to the States, I embraced the culture, I embraced everything about American society, Americanism, and I'm living here. I'm a guest here now. It's become, my country. And I also just think in other parts of the world, including England, it's like if you move there, if you go there, embrace the culture, embrace the country, embrace everything that it has to be. I just don't think we should be changing people for who they are. And I think that we should be embracing it. You know, of course, when there's human rights issues, that just takes the conversation to another level. Right. 35 minutes in, and have we mentioned Gabriel?
We've not even spoken about Arsenal yet.
Right, let's get stuck into this. Okay, you broke the story, and I've been talking about this since last summer, actually, Ben, because it seemed like Mikel, I don't want to say punished Gabriel, keeping him out of the team when he was maybe flirting with the whole Saudi thing. And by the way, you guys, the conversation Ben and I have had is no reflection on players. They're taking an opportunity. They're being offered a lot of money. If I or Ben were offered, you know, $10 million right now by ESPN FC, we would probably go and work for ESPN for 10 million a year. There's no doubt about that. The monetization is unbelievable. And if you can secure generational wealth for your family, I totally get it. And some people might take issue with it. But talk to me about this story. And is it myth? Is it fact? Are you going to upset me now, Ben? I mean, because for me, he's a player that we have to keep at all costs.
Yeah, and that is Arsenal's position. So that's the first thing to say. And we know that there are ongoing talks to extend his contract, which expires in 2027, but they'll now be picked up by Andrea Berta. My expectation with Berta is that Arsenal will make that official either this week or certainly during the international break. He's already signed. So Berta's got a lot to inherit, and I'm sure we'll touch upon a number of things in terms of incomings and outgoings, and Gabriel's contract extension is one of them. Now, at this point, you don't have to do the contract extension because it's 2027, not 2026, but it's probably the peak window in which Arsenal can get a significant window-changing fee. And if it turns out they want to spend big in other areas, despite being PSR compliant, there could be a number by which Arsenal are tempted if Gabriel said, actually, I want the opportunity now. I think what's more likely to be clear is that he'll tell Saudi to wait a year or two. Arsenal will see him as a future captain, and he'll either end up seeing out his contract or extending. But the point is, Al Nassr want to try. And the reason why they want to try now is because there's a big new second wave push. So as we discussed at the beginning of the show, 2023 was wave one. And then between 2023 and the last winter window, most of the clubs have filled their quota, which is 8 any age foreigners and 2 foreigners who are under the age of 21. And once you've made those signings, particularly in 2023, they sign 2 to 3 year deals. So you can't go summer to summer to summer and keep spending and bringing in as much volume of players because there's just not the space unless you're basically saying to players that have arrived, sorry, we're going to push you out after a year. So we're almost going to see the Saudi windows in terms of their craziness in the summer skip a year, maybe even 2 years as the project stabilizes. And what I'm told is 2025 is the next big Saudi wave where the volume of business is expected to be very similar to 2023.
Interesting.
So Al Nassr are looking for a winger, and assuming Ronaldo extends, which there's a very strong possibility because they've got John Duran, they won't go for another striker, and then they want a centre-back and a full-back and possibly a backup goalkeeper. So Gabriel's very high in their thinking. They've made contact with the player. It's a very strange situation to get your head around because I know people will say, well, are they not tapping him up? How can you make contact with the player? It's outside of a window. Don't you have to inform Arsenal? But really, all the Saudi project does is pitch blindly. And it's not uncommon for players I know of, like Vinicius Jr. is another good example, to wake up and, believe it or not, have an email in their inbox that's stamped and is non-binding and says, we want to speak to you about the project. Here's the terms up front, in a hope that that bait of the financials will get the player to engage. So Gabriel has that offer, if you like, but it's not been prompted by his side. He's not engaged with it. He's not negotiating with them, but he has a physical offer because of how the Saudi project works. And they drop them almost like your Harry Potter letter would arrive, where it just comes in through the letterbox or your inbox, and you're like, oh, okay, wow, they're interested in me. And then from there, a wider conversation is expected to take place. From Arsenal's point of view, like I say, they want to keep him. They want him to extend. They see him as a future captain. If the player agitates for a move and Arsenal were to be persuaded, then I'm told you're looking at a minimum of 100 million euros, and it might even be north of 100 million pounds to get Arsenal to even consider speaking to Al Nassr. But one thing is for sure, to my knowledge, that if between now and when the summer window opens, Gabriel has not signed a new Arsenal contract, then Al Nassr are going to make a formal bid to see whether they can either turn the player's head or get Arsenal to engage.
So interesting, very interesting. And I wanted to put Shatanya's comment up here because when we bought Calafiori, a lot of Arsenal fans felt like the eventual partnership might be Calafiori and Saliba together. And I know, you got right foot, left foot, the way Mikel Arteta, kind of wants to play. How much, if Arsenal are offered 100 million, Ben, is that something they can say no to? Because you do look at, like I said, for me, it's a non-negotiable. How do you replace someone like Gabriel? What centre-back is there in the world right now? Unless Virgil van Dijk fancies a swan song project at the end of his career. How do you say no to that kind of money? And then, is there the possibility, you mentioned a winger, are they looking at Trossard, Martinelli? How far does the scope go in terms of interest in Arsenal players? But let's start with the temptation for the club for the money and the player for the money.
Yeah, I think the temptation for Arsenal will be less because he's 27. And if he extends, for example, you can always say possibly, like Liverpool are thinking, Saudi might come back. So if you take the Salah example, let's say Salah extends at Liverpool and they're optimistic, then he's tied down to a contract, which means that if he ends up going to Saudi a bit later in his career, then because he'd be under contract at Liverpool for potentially 2 or 3 years, you're still going to get that fee. And it'll be the same with Arsenal, that if they turn down an offer now, then they may feel Saudi could return in 26. He's got a year left on his current deal, or they may feel Gabriel extends, and then you totally protect the value. And maybe when he's 29 or 30, Saudi will still be interested. And that's the kind of weakness of the Saudi pitch, that they allow players the knowledge, particularly elite names, that if they don't want to come immediately, then the offer may stand in a year's time or 2 years' time. And
at the same price?
Patience. Yeah, potentially. I mean, the same package to the player, but obviously it depends on their contractual situation, what they'll end up paying to the club. And sometimes they try and offset that, where if they think the player's going to string them along all summer, or use them as leverage for a new deal. In other times, Saudi will say, dear Gabriel, here's your offer. You've got 3 days to decide. Otherwise, the offer's off the table. And I know when, for example, Steven Gerrard was employed at Al Ittifaq, he was told he had to make an immediate decision by the end of the week. Otherwise, the offer would be pulled. So there are pressure tactics used, but generally the project would say to a player and to a club, if your position is you're not going to sell now, we'll come back to you in future windows and we'll protect that relationship. And that's partly because driving the central recruitment is Michael Emenalo, who used to be at Chelsea. He's very well respected. He's very well known by all of the clubs. So he trusts them, and implicitly they use him and believe that what he's presenting them is very upfront. And that's different to perhaps if it was all Saudis, they were an unknown entity. So this is why the Saudi project are using European and known negotiators, because then the clubs have already worked with them in historical roles. And as a consequence, if they need to do future business, they can. So I think we're in a scenario where it's more likely than not that Gabriel stays. And in terms of what money might turn Arsenal's head, it's hard to tell, because my understanding is without any exit as of now, they're PSR compliant and there's budget to be spent. And therefore, if you look at what they would need for a number 9, whether that's Shesko or Isak, a wide, likely left-sided attacker, whether that's Nico Williams or Mateus Cunha, a number 6 in Zubimendi, possibly a Bruno Guimaraes, likely a left-back, probably a backup goalkeeper. All of that, even if you got at-value players in the 30 to 50 million mark, which is probably what you have to spend to get an elite player at a bare minimum in each of these areas, you're already looking at 250 to 300 million. And given Arsenal are planning for all of these positions, with a few outgoings, your Jorginhos, maybe Thomas Partey, maybe Zinchenko, Kieran Tierney expected to go to Celtic, but none of them are getting you huge money that's offsetting that spend. So I'm not under the impression that Arsenal need 100 million to finance these other deals. I think they're going to plough ahead and have a big summer regardless. And that might be why they say, to your very important point, is there actually much logic in selling a centre-back for 100 million and everyone saying, now we're going to have a big market, but then us not being able to find a replacement or having to spend 60 to 80 million on a centre-back replacement, and he still might not even be as good as Gabriel.
Yeah. So, and that's a great point. And I think, you know, we both agree on that. To me, there's not the non-negotiable players are Saliba, Gabriel, Timber now for me, I think has become one of Arteta's most significant signings. Of course, Saka and Lewis Skelly-Waneri just coming into the mix. Let me ask you this then. And I love being educated on how things work in this new league. And it's interesting that you say that they're looking for a 2023 type of push in 2025. Trossard was another name that was mentioned earlier on in the season. I'm not ready to give up on Martinelli, but in order maybe to get that extra edge in the league, to close the deal, to win the Premier League, have you seen enough to need an upgrade, and is his market value around that 70 million mark? What do you see Arsenal doing from what you know, from what you see? You mentioned Zubimendi. There's interest in, you know, paying the Sesko clause and Williams. What do you think the true reality is with Andrea Berta coming in, Ben, and that he has all the power? Because I think what Arsenal fans really want is they want Berta to have all the power. We spoke to Graham Hunter about Berta and Kevin Hatchard as well, and they both felt like he had more hits than he did misses. Very good, not only at buying, selling. Maybe the João Felix is kind of like the biggest pickle for him financially in terms of what he's done at Atleti. But we want Berta to have all the power because Arsenal need a shift in the transfer market. What's your take on the reality and what you think is going to happen in the summer?
Yeah, I think the reality is that there'll be an element of inheriting because clubs are planning 3 to 5 windows ahead. So kind of Edu legacy will still be around in this summer, but Berta will have maybe more control and in the dynamic with Arteta, a little bit more authority than Edu did. So what Arsenal really liked about the Edu-Arteta relationship was that the manager was fully invested, was very hands-on, and that's not just about saying what target do you want, it's saying how can we work collectively to both go and get that target. And Edu allowed Mikel Arteta a lot of room in the pitch, and the more rope you give the manager in a pitch, the harder it is to then say to the manager, actually, we've decided, despite all your best efforts and taking time out to have that Zoom call and texting the player and telling them that you've got certain guarantees and here's their development. If you then change your mind and go in a different direction, the manager can kind of feel a bit like stabbed in the back. And football models increasingly have to be collaborative and take power away from the manager, because the reality is whether Arteta succeeds and wins several trophies or whether he falls short, he's not going to be at the club forever. And I think there is a logical theory that if Berta starts today and wants to stay at Arsenal for at least a decade, then Berta's now going to be at Arsenal longer than Mikel Arteta, which means that he has to think about the club and its model, not just the manager at the time. Even if it works perfectly between Arteta and Berta, how many managers stay at football clubs for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years? But sporting directors that work can stay for that kind of period of time. So Berta, I think, will have a bit more power, but ultimately Mikel Arteta was heavily involved in the recruitment process, and they've picked someone they think can work well with Arteta, knowing that he is hands-on. Where Berta will be different to Edu is, first of all, he's a bit more now focused. So we know with Edu that he stuck to valuations. He fought hard in the market, which is a good thing because it protects Arsenal's position. And then you don't get fleeced the next deal and the next deal. So at the time, walking away from Mudryk appeared a disaster because Mudryk had basically said publicly he wanted to go to Arsenal. Chelsea hijack it, and Arsenal fans feel really disappointed. They didn't get Caicedo in a winter window. He ends up going to Chelsea. And again, even though Arsenal got Rice, some fans in that winter window, when they bid about 70 million and Caicedo made that statement, they were disappointed. And a lot of Arsenal fans say the same thing to me. Why do we not just dig a little bit deeper behind the couch? Why do we not just put up that extra 5 million to get deals over the line? And I think the answer, in short, was that when Edu was driving the project, it was very sustainable, it was very future-proof, and it was very much about a mixture of getting players for the now, but also tapping in early to what now are commonplace markets. But when Edu first started in South America, it wasn't as often that you saw a flurry of South Americans coming over. And they were young and they were different in their style. And once they've acclimatized, some of them have done very well for Arsenal Football Club. With Berta, you'll see him dive into Europe a lot more. You'll see him, where necessary, sign a more proven quality of player, which he did at Atletico Madrid as well. You won't see him be that put off by things like age, within reason. And I know Mikel Arteta's the same with Mikel Merino or Jorginho. So we're not really going to be moving towards a Chelsea project of all youth. We're not going to be moving towards an emerging markets to find value. We're going to see Arsenal, I think, return to reasonably established names, and Berta's strength will be in getting them at value, using his relationships to find a deal, in the same way that everyone said Julian Alvarez would never end up going to Atletico Madrid. Everyone said Atleti would have no means to afford Conor Gallagher, and no one would persuade him to move away from Chelsea, along with, historically, your Luis Suarez's, your Rodri's. So that's his real strength, in striking a deal almost unexpectedly at times, which is why Atleti were able to still maintain a sustainable model of their own. And at the same time, if you look at where his real strength is, it's finding players that are probably not unknowns, but already announced to the football world, and realizing that even if you think they're good, even if you think they're established, they can get even better. So I think Arsenal will not only be about now entering a race for a young Brazilian kid or a midfielder that we've not heard of, or a relatively surprise signing like Calafiori. Arsenal will be more now about saying who's actually indisputably going to go straight into this starting 11 with a bigger price tag over them. And that's why this first summer is very important, because you don't get many windows like the Timber Declan Rice one, or potentially this summer. And if you choose to have that big window and that big overhaul, then if you don't get it right, then come the next summer, there's probably not the same 200, 300 million to be spent. So he's going to have to hit the ground running. And I think his CV should allow him to do that.
Yeah, that's great stuff, because I put this stuff up when Kevin Hatchard was here, and you mentioned some of those sales and purchases, you know, when you look at, you know, the Rodri type of player, the Cunha type of player as well, Ben, the ingoings and outgoings, you know, you're hitting the nail on the head right there. Can you talk me through a little bit? Do I have you for another like 5 or 6 minutes? I know
you
you've
can
got,
take your time. All is good.
Okay, awesome. Because talking about MOTs for the first 15 minutes, and we're also getting more people into the chat right now. This is really good. Where does he stand? One of the issues that I think is escalating in football, but it's also escalated at Arsenal too. But it had to in order, and it really kind of was the Ozil, give him what he wants, the Aubameyang, give him what he wants. Now you've got players like Zinchenko who are on close to 200 grand. You've got all of these. Where does Berta in the negotiation part of it? But then also you've got these players on this type of money. How do you think this plays out for Arsenal? And where does Berta stand on wages? I'd love to be educated. Like, I don't know what Alvarez is making a week at Atletico Madrid. Do you know what I mean? Where does that lie, do you think, with him?
Yeah, I think Atleti's salaries are, as you would expect, significantly lower than any Premier League club. So he did have to work on a tight budget. To give you an example, Conor Gallagher moves and he's getting something in the region of 150,000 a week. And I think that makes him the third highest earner at the club. Jan Oblak is on 400,000 euros a week. So that's about, 320k. Antoine Griezmann will be up there with the top earners as well. But Alvarez's wage is actually only about 110k a week in terms of its gross base. So there's nothing shabby about that. But I would say Atletico Madrid, if you exclude Jan Oblak, the rest of their players are roughly earning what maybe the top 10 earners would be getting at Newcastle. So he'll immediately be dealing with a higher wage bill. And one thing that we sort of saw with Berta at Atleti is he is prepared to have a mismatch. So a lot of clubs these days, they want it to be incentive driven. And they say you can have a sky high wage if you do X, Y, and Z, either as a team or individually. If you get Champions League, if you score 10 plus goals, 20 plus goals, win bonuses, and so on. And when you choose to have that model, you have to kind of push down your top earners, which is why Chelsea, for example, want Raheem Sterling off the books. And you have to raise the level of the lowest earners to make sure that if they break in early in the team and they're young, they don't feel like, wait a minute, why am I only on 30, 35k when every other member of my starting 11 is on 3 times that? And this is why, for example, Manchester United are going to have to renew Kobbie Mainoo because his wage is tiny compared to certain other players that are not performing for Manchester United, that are injured or are only on the bench. I think Berta's perspective is a bit different, and he will give players traditionally higher wages, and he will work within a collective wage number, which won't increase. It will be Arsenal's budgeted wage bill without bonuses, but he'll reallocate it a bit differently. And he will be prepared to get certain players off the wage bill and recommend a smaller squad size, maybe 23 to 25 instead of 25 to 29. And then if on a case-by-case basis, you get a big signing that proves value, like Nico Williams, if you can drive down the agent costs, if you think the release clause is market value, you say, okay, we're going to pay him what he wants, even though we know the wage is high. And even though we know that other players may say, why is he earning more than I am? But Berta's the kind of person historically, if we look at his Atleti record, that will do that. So it will be the same collective wage bill, but I think it will be allocated a bit more liberally. And you can do that if you reduce your squad size and back the group, because then by getting some of the wages off the books, you can actually have your cake and eat it. You can use some of the money to incentivize the younger, lower earners, and they're happy with any incremental rise. And then you can take the rest of it and you can throw that at a couple of big signings and say, you know what? It's actually worth paying the higher wage and having a big difference between our lowest earner and our highest earner because we've saved due to negotiating a deal at value, or we found a player that has a release clause that we think is below market value. So that's where many may turn around, like we saw in De Edu with Nico Williams. And the message from Arsenal sources, from Chelsea sources, was basically, he's too expensive. And everyone goes, well, why? Because the release clause seems like a really good number. But you got to add taxes, you got to add agent fees, you got to add sign-on bonus, and he's already on 200,000 euros a week, and naturally would want more than that to move to the Premier League. So then Arsenal and Edu and Chelsea and their sporting team run a mile, because one, at that point, you don't want to set the precedent of saying, I know we told everyone else we're pinching the pennies on wages and we want all of our squad to earn a relatively similar amount, but now we're actually prepared to have somebody on double the wages or something like that. And then that can cause squad unrest. So that's the old Arsenal, and that's Chelsea at the moment, and that's Manchester United under Jim Ratcliffe. Berta, from what I hear, and based on some of his Atletico deals, will bend to player wages as long as there's overall value in the deal, which might mean there's certain targets like Williams that Arsenal just walked away from under Edu that they revisit now Berta's in charge.
Very interesting. A few of our listeners talking about the squad depth part, and that's come back to bite us in the arse this season, majorly, right? So we've got no cover. We never had a striker to begin with. We had Havertz. I mean, his lone man wolf, he's totally burnt out. No cover for that. No cover for Saka until the emergence of Waneri, who some people would like to see as a number 10. But of course, he stepped in for Saka. Maybe Mikel should have played him earlier in the season when Odegaard was injured. So injuries have definitely been a factor this season, and not having a plan or being prepared. I talked about preparedness a couple of weeks ago, Ben, that we just haven't been prepared for that. What I'm really interested in is, it's funny because I said I want Berta to have all the power, and there are a couple of people who say we don't want him having all the power. Really? Have you seen where we've been over the last few years in the transfer market? And I know like Tim Lewis will still be involved. I'm sure Richard Garlick will be involved. Mikel will be involved. Yeah. But I really do hope that, Josh Kroenke steps in and says, this is your show, mate. You run it. You've got a proven track record. So what I'd like to know is, we talked a little bit about the hierarchy and how that would work. How do you think this looks for me? I'm not a Mikel Arteta out person, but when you get such a strong sporting director coming in, number one, does that sporting director deserve to start with a blank canvas with their own manager, right? How does that relationship work? And then number two, do you see, and I put Archangel's comment up because he's like, holy cow, how are we not in for Julian Alvarez, right? With those types of numbers that you were talking about. Does he have the pull? And I asked Kevin Hatchard this too, because I said, how much of it is Berta and Simeone? And of course, we know Simeone is a force, right? But how do you see that part playing out? Like poaching players from Atleti, Berta's pedigree, in terms of all this happening. Diego Simeone seems like an Atletico Madrid lifer, but the managerial side of things and him starting with his own guy, like, what's your take on all of that?
Yeah, I think Mikel Arteta is safe. He obviously only recently signed a new deal. I don't think this season will have a reflection, or Berta will have the remit to be saying, we need to change manager. Like I said before, there's a logic that if Berta works, he'll be at the football club longer than Mikel Arteta, whether Mikel Arteta wins trophies or not, just because that's football, and very few managers do a decade at one club. So there could come a time in the hypothetical future where Berta runs a process to find a manager, and that might be because either it's not worked with Arteta over a longer period of time, it might be because Arteta gets a job offer from somebody else, it might be because it works with Arteta and he walks away, in the same way that eventually Pep Guardiola, who's won lots of trophies, is going to walk away from Manchester City, or Alex Ferguson just retired. Of course, Arteta is much younger than Fergie, so you can have another scenario that just says he's a lifer at Arsenal. But I think if you were playing the odds, you would say if Arteta works and Berta works, then there will come a point in time where the sporting director is maybe more likely to stay for 10 years than the manager staying for 10 years from now. So Berta will know that there might be an opportunity in the future, but that's not what he's thinking. What he's thinking is Mikel Arteta was part of the team, and in a very hands-on way, that employed him. And one of Arsenal's job remits was who is going to specifically have the best relationship and work most effectively with Mikel Arteta. So this isn't really about Berta coming in and changing Arsenal's model dramatically. It's more just changing how they spend their finances, how they find value with those finances in the market, and how they negotiate to get the best possible deals, as opposed to saying, I don't like the manager having this much say or autonomy. I don't like the model that you have at the moment. I don't like the position you're in. I think Berta will be licking his lips because he'll see the foundations at Arsenal, which is probably what's so frustrating to many of the fans. And he'll be thinking, if I can finesse this and improve this in a few key areas, then we are going to be serious contenders. And it's really easy to look at Arsenal and go, Gabriel Jesus only scores against Crystal Palace, comes back, gets injured. Kai Havertz hasn't lived up to expectation, even though he has got into double figures in seasons. You've got Odegaard, who doesn't quite look the same this season. You've got Thomas Partey, who's probably leaving. You've got Gabriel Martinelli, who divides the fan base. You've got Zinchenko, who might be departing. Kearney's going to go. Jorginho's going to go. Sterling hasn't worked. And then you start looking down and going, well, other than Nwaneri, Lewis Skelly, who's really left in terms of depth? And that's one way of looking at it. But the other way of looking at it is it's an outstanding back line when they're all fit. It's an incredible central midfield when they all play to their potential. Saka is arguably the best in his position. So if you can just add a number 9 and more cover on that left side and maybe one more defender on the left side, then that's going to be the difference between finishing second or finishing third. So I don't think Berta will be thinking there's critical issues with the model. I think he'll just be quite excited because it'll almost feel like if he takes a similar approach to what he did at Atleti, because he'll have more backing, more resource, more funding, more wages to work with, he'll be able to, within those means, do quite a lot. So earlier we mentioned the salaries at Atleti. If you think about Arsenal salaries, it won't, like I said before, be a case of he has to persuade Arsenal to pay someone 350k or 400k to get your Victor Gyökeres's, your Victor Osimhen's, or whoever else it may be, Alexander Isak. It's more a case of if you decide to move on from Kai Havertz, you're saving 280k a week that you can throw on another elite name and you'll get virtually anyone, bar your Vinny Juniors of this world. You get virtually anyone for 280k or 300k a week. If Gabriel Jesus departs, that's the second highest earner at the club gone. If Partey goes, then that's the top 5 earner, and it's another 200k a week that you can remove from the books. If Martinelli ends up departing, that's another 180 to 200k. So add all of that up, and if they can find the right fee and persuade a player to join, then wages are probably not a stumbling block, because if you just take their existing wage budget now and have that kind of clear out, then there is the money to actually invest big wages in players. And he didn't always have that at Atletico Madrid. So I think Berta will be very excited about this summer. And I don't expect the recruitment model to change. I just expect Berta to look in different markets and reallocate funds differently so as to change not the total amount of finances on offer for fees and wages and agents' fees, but just the balance in how they're actually allocated.
Yeah, that's it's a very interesting point, actually. I mean, barring Jesus, who's probably not got market value right now because of the injury, but Zinchenko, you've got Kieran Tierney, you've got Thomas Partey, like you said, who's a high earner. The potential of Trossard, maybe going, upgrading on Martinelli. I mean, there's definitely room and cushion there, no doubt. Right, I've got some quick fire ones for you from the listeners, and then we'll let you go and have your tea. Okay, so seeing as we were talking about Trossard, one from Jimmy Newton for you. Will Saudi go after Trossard again this summer? I did bring it up earlier. You mentioned loosely, but do you think there's genuine interest in Trossard maybe not being an Arsenal player after the summer?
Yeah, I'm not aware of a Saudi bid for Trossard incoming this summer. It's true there was historical interest, but at that point, the player said he didn't want to go, the same as Karim Matoma did for Brighton in the winter market. So if Saudi returned for Trossard would have to change his mind about Saudi Arabia. And at the moment, I'm not aware that he's one of the players that wants to move over there. There will be a big push for left-sided players, though. We know Al Ahly, even though they signed Galeno from Porto, are looking for another flagship left-sided attacker. And there's been links, for example, with both Luis Diaz and even incredibly Vinny Jr. as well. I think Diaz is more likely than Vinny Jr. this summer, but don't be surprised if Saudi try. And again, to understand Saudi, you have to, and this is why I'm reporting, you might hear me always say central deal makers. You have to understand that the clubs don't have the money to sign a Trossard, most of them anyway. So they gain their slice of central funds. And every single season, there's about 2 billion euros, which the Ministry of Sport and Saudi Pro League allocate to the clubs. And it's not an exact allocation. You say what you want, and then you get a slice of the pie. So because of that recruitment model, Michael Emenalo, the sporting director for the Saudi Pro League, and members of the Ministry of Sport control the purse strings and negotiate a lot of these deals. And when they do that, they can effectively say, we've got 5 expressions of interest from 5 different clubs. We're going to negotiate without allocating a club. We're going to see if the player wants to agree. If the player gives buy-in, we're then going to find the best fit for that player and tell them what club they're joining. And that's not the case for every transfer, but for the big ones it is. So you get a lot of vagaries as a result where, yeah, there may be some Saudi interest in Trossard, but there's no specific club yet. And there's no confidence that he wants to join the project. But you might find later down the line, Trossard changes his mind. And then Michael Emenalo starts going, right, now we've got to find him a club. So people like to have more specific links with Saudi, but sometimes the actual final destination isn't known. So to just give you like a quick story, I know this is a quick fire round and I'm rambling on, but N'Golo Kante, when he was heading into free agency at Chelsea in 2023, got an offer from the central deal makers, and Al Nassr thought they were front of the queue. And Al Nassr sources were briefing it's done because Kante said yes. And they were celebrating and they were about to fly over and take their photos with Kante. And then suddenly it all went quiet. And it was because the central deal makers went, actually, we'll send him to Al Ittihad because Al Ittihad have got the Club World Cup in Saudi Arabia that year. And we want Kante and Benzema to play for Al Ittihad because then they'll both get to play in the Club World Cup. And I think I genuinely knew, as ridiculous as it sounds, I knew he was going to Al Ittihad before my source at Al Nassr. And my source at Al Nassr was in the room negotiating with N'Golo Kante a week before. And I was telling him, I know you think that you're about to unveil Kante, but I'm told he's going to Al Ittihad. So the club can change unpredictably. And that's why sometimes you just hear, oh, yeah, there's Saudi interest in Trossard. There's Saudi interest in Gabriel. And you think, well, where? Who's going to bid? Where's the fit? Who's he playing with? And all of that is sometimes only decided at the last minute.
Very interesting. I would say if Gabriel wanted to go, he'd want to play, if he's going to play, the opportunities. It's like Duran, paired with Ronaldo. That's a very educational. Thank you. I did not know. Because obviously I cover Major League Soccer too, and you've got collective bargaining agreements. You've like NBA, the model in the US where there's salary caps and, there's much more kind of parity. Ben, you cover the games here as well. But it's kind of like the NBA putting the kibosh on the super teams, right? Not wanting to, whereas, in Saudi, the idea of it being this central kind of, you go here, you go there, you go there. I didn't know it worked that way. So appreciate the education on that for sure. Luke wants to know real quick, this one. Do you know if Berta's already at London Colney working for us?
He's in London and he's signed. So the short answer is yes, but officially he hasn't signed and he hasn't been unveiled, but I expect that to change during the international break. So Berta signed his contract now about 10 days ago, and therefore he is an Arsenal employee. As far as I'm aware, there's no gardening leave preventing him from beginning immediately. He left Atleti in January, And Arsenal have got a great relationship with Atleti anyway. So there's nothing stopping him from starting immediately. And therefore, yes, whether officially or unofficially, he is working on projects because there's been outreach to players, there's been introductions. But now we just have to wait for the formal announcement. And as I said before, I expect that to be either this week or next week and before the international break
Okay, cool.
ends. And also the other thing is that Berta has been taking English lessons since late last year.
Nice. Very nice. I'm very excited about him, I have to say. Pure Vibes Ent. I'm going to add another one into this, and let's just do this in a nutshell, right? We mentioned the names. You've talked about a lot of players. You know, you talked about the the pot, if you like, wages versus when you're looking at plays like this, 50 million, and then you're already up to 300 if you're looking at a left winger, a striker, a midfielder, a left back, etc. Williams, Kudus, Isaac has come up in the last few days. Fabrizio Romano talked about that. To me, it feels like if he's 150 million, we've blown either all our budget or half our budget. Of those players mentioned for Arsenal, Ben, what's your hunch? What do you think?
Kudus, no. I think there'll be firm Saudi interest in Kudus after Al Nassr tried for Mitoma and bid up to 90 million, and Mitoma said no, and Brighton therefore turned it down. They made a late approach to West Ham for Kudus, and I think there will be significant Saudi interest that may be difficult for West Ham to turn down. I'm not aware of too much between Arsenal and Kudus at this stage, even though he has been a player on and off linked. I think that left side will come down to Nico Williams at the moment anyway, and Cunha. And from what I'm told, Berta really likes the profile of Cunha. There's a release clause for Cunha, 62.5 million. It stays the same whether Wolves go down or stay up. Of course, it's looking more likely they're going to stay up. And the wages would be far less than Nico Williams. So it's a strange one because if you spell it out, Nico Williams' release clause is 58 million euros, which is what, about 48 million quid. Cunha's 62.5. One is an outstanding elite footballer that also is on the radar of several other clubs, including Chelsea and Barcelona. That's Williams. And then you've got Cunha, who's more proven Premier League quality and maybe has the slight advantage, if you think what Arsenal need, that he can play through the middle or he can go on the left side, whether as an attacker or as a winger. And you would think that 48 million for Williams is quite hard to turn down because it is a pretty incredible fee. But when you add the taxes, the agent fees and the wage, Williams is more expensive than Cunha because Cunha has less agent fees, smaller sign-on fee, much lower wages. So over time, that extra sort of 15 million roughly on fee for Cunha could provide better value than for Nico Williams. So I think if we were speaking about Edu and Arsenal a year ago, I'd have said Williams is very high in their thinking. But it wouldn't surprise me now if a change we see when Berta comes in is more of a push towards Cunha over Williams. And then with the striker, look, we have to be respectful to Newcastle. They've just won a fantastic League Cup. If you want to negotiate with Newcastle, you don't mention the I word now, next week, even next month, because the only way you're going to get Alexander Isak is if you have a good relationship with Newcastle. And as you can imagine, it's a point of frustration within Newcastle that every single week there's an Isak to Arsenal, Isak to Chelsea, Isak to Liverpool, Isak to Barcelona story. And that is, of course, because all these clubs not only like Isak, but are planning on trying for Isak. But there'll come a point where, and Berta's very good at this, and I think Liverpool's recruitment team are, there'll come a point where Newcastle's reality is clear. So there's grandstanding at the moment. Darren Eales, the outgoing CEO, has said the club would be crazy to sell Isak. Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the Saudi chair of Newcastle, has said, hold on to Isak at all costs. But this is an element of grandstanding. And the player will have a say. Newcastle's end of season will have a say. Have they got Champions League or not? And then, of course, we need to understand whether or not Newcastle will preempt a summer saga and get Isak to sign a new deal. And if they did that before the window opens, then all of this airtime, even though it's less work for me about Alexander Isak, will go out the window. Because if he signs a new deal between now and when the window opens, he clearly won't be available in the summer. Even if he has a release clause, it would be very unlikely that that release clause would be immediately active. So there's just too many moving parts with Isak. Yes, Arsenal like him. Yes, he's the dream target. Yes, he's the number one target. But all of us have got number one things we want in the world. And we know that those things are fictional, pie-in-the-sky dreams that are highly, highly unlikely to happen. My number one target would be to win the lottery, retire, never have to speak about football or transfers
I bought
again.
one today.
But it's a
Don't
1
usually
in 1 billion chance. So that's what we have to understand. Is Isak genuinely available? And I think Berta will get a very quick read on that. If he is available, he becomes Arsenal's top choice. If he isn't available, then I would be relatively confident in saying Arsenal will make a significant play on Benjamin Sesko. And I think that is a very likely deal to happen. Again, relatively good value. The release clause is 70 million euros, relatively low wage, middle of the pack in terms of Arsenal earners, already sold on the project. And therefore, Sesko to Arsenal has a very high percentage chance if Arsenal choose to pull the trigger. But they're not going to pull the trigger until they know the Isak question. And if you ask the Isak question now, when Newcastle are hungover, celebrating, and then sobered up and focused on qualifying for the Champions League, they're going to say, come on, like, talk to us at the right time. And now is not the right time. So you're going to read a lot about Isak. And maybe I'm guilty of this as well. Because if you're asked about it, you answer it. And the more people that ask you about it, the more it gets on social media. And the more people say, Ben Jacobs said this. Why are you constantly repeating the Isak narrative? But I'm telling you right now, to be clear, whether it's quoted, whether it's taken in context, or whether it's taken out of context, no club is going to make any progress on Alexander Isak in March and in early April. Nobody is going to be a front runner. Nobody is going to have a price quoted. Nobody is going to be anywhere near signing Alexander Isak now. Then when we get into late April, early May, and Newcastle's season and their Champions League qualification and any Isak new deal and Newcastle's PSR position, etc. When all of that settles, the suitors will start to make formal engagement, and then they will have their answer. And to be honest with you, until we get to that late April, early May period, or unless, of course, Newcastle do something internal and Isak signs first, but all of the suitors' side of things, it's just going to go round in this giant media cycle of speculation, and there will be zero progress, zero clarity, and zero anything until Newcastle, who have got all the cards, decide the right time is to either get Isak to extend and end this saga, or genuinely get in a room with suitors to see if a number, whether that's 150 million at the highest end or a British transfer record at the lowest end, is possible. And they're just not going to have that conversation now at such a historic moment in their season and at such a crucial part of their push for Champions League football. So we are just going to have to hold and be patient, even though every day there will probably be a new story in the media about it.
Yeah, no, it's going to be, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they make Champions League football that he stays at Newcastle for another year. And, you know, I don't know, Harry Kane's half the price. I know some Arsenal fans won't want me to say that out loud, but I'll take him.
Kane won't come to Arsenal.
No, I know he won't. I know he won't. And also I know some listeners will think I'm wacky, but a player who I think, before I let you go, and we've got, it's been a bumper show today, you guys. You didn't get one on Monday, on Tuesday. So Ben has been very generous with his time. I know some fans will think I'm crazy, right? but I think there's a cut price deal to be made for a certain player. And a little bit like Rashford, a player that needs a second wind and a second bite at the cherry. I think he needs to move for his own kind of, off the field, maybe behavior, but there's still a great player in this guy. And what's a cheeky bid for Jack Grealish this summer, Ben?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think Jack Grealish has a massive decision to make because he's heading into a World Cup year and it feels like he's very distant from Thomas Tuchel's plans. So I'm not aware of the price. And part of that is because, believe it or not, Pep Guardiola is, ironically, because he's not starting Grealish week in, week out, the driving force at this point in keeping Grealish. And the manager has so much faith in Grealish, even if only as a squad player, that Grealish has never really agitated for a move. And now we're going to head into a summer where he may have to. And obviously, there's nothing yet linking Arsenal and Grealish. But as you rightly say, there might be a deal there to be had. And I would guess Manchester City, who don't stand in their players' ways, would value Grealish outgoing, similar to Raheem Sterling, in that kind of £45 million mark, which some will say is high, given his form at the moment, and others will think it's a steal. I mean, 45 million is only 3 million less than Nico Williams. But again, Grealish's wage, Grealish's agents' fees, Grealish's sign-on bonuses, etc., would all probably be lower than Nico Williams. So there is a deal there to be had for somebody and Jack Grealish. I'm just not sure that that type of player will be in Berta's thinking at the moment. Because like I said before, I think Berta won't, if you look at Atleti, only go for value or only go for a gamble, like Villa did with Marcus Rashford to an extent as well. Berta will sign players, if we're looking at Atleti, at a certain price. So, sometimes in football, big clubs now, they'll band around under 45 million or under 50 million. And they'll say, if you can get a really elite player at that number, especially if they're young, then that's really good value in the current market, which inflates window on window on window. But I think Berta's almost the flip of that, as we saw with Julian Alvarez, as we saw with buying Griezmann, selling Griezmann, buying Griezmann back. Berta has a number, which at Atleti was about 40 million euros. And if that transfers above 40 million euros, in Berta's mind, they have to be an indisputable starter. They have to be indisputably improving the team. They have to be indisputably somebody that is going to come in and own a position. Otherwise, he starts saying, okay, we may as well spend that 40 million on a 35 million youngster that will take 3 years to blood through, or we'll turn to another target because the price compared to the players standing in the team is a mismatch. So I don't know what the number will be at Arsenal. It will have to be adjusted because obviously Arsenal's budget and Premier League budgets are bigger than Atleti. But you'll notice over time with Berta, if he follows the same pattern as he did at Atleti, that when the players are over a certain amount, and I wouldn't speculate what that number is, but like I said, at Atleti, it was about 40 million euros. Griezmann, Luis Suarez, Conor Gallagher, Julian Alvarez. Most of these players, when he commits to that spend, are indisputable squad improvers and starters. And I think that is what would probably put him off Grealish, that whatever the price is for Grealish, if we're hypothetically talking about Grealish and Arsenal, I think the price you would pay, you would not be getting a player that would definitively be starting. And if Arsenal spend above that number, it might be 50, it might be 60, who knows? But over time, we'll see a pattern. You will notice, like I said right at the beginning of the show, that Berta players tend to be ones, maybe he promises it to them in the pitch as well. They do become 30, if they're fit, 35 out of 38 game starters. And if you look through Atleti's signings, the ones that have worked for big money, you'll see that if they're fit, they're starting. And Simeone is not a great, in La Liga anyway, rotator. So that will be another interesting thing as well. How does Berta work with Arteta? If Berta's signing players and saying, you're just going to be starting in this position, how does Arteta handle that? How do the players integrate in a squad that all want to start? And some of them might have started last season. But it wouldn't remotely surprise me if Arsenal have a big summer and let's just say they get a flagship number 9, they get a brand new left winger, they get at least a number 6, and they get a left back. Left back's probably the only question because Arsenal have got great options there. Just because Kearney and Zinchenko go, your left back might be young because you've got good options there. But in that 6, even with Odegaard and Rice, in that left side, even with Trossard and Martinelli, and in that number 9, even if Gabi Jesus is fit and with Havertz, I think, it's just an opinion, by the way, but it's informed by what he did at Atleti. I think those 3 positions coming in, the players will be signed for and be told, you are the number 1 in that position. Whereas if you look at Edu and Arteta and the whole Ramsdale-Raya situation, we constantly got told over and over again for about 3 months that he hasn't decided on his number 1, that Ramsdale and Raya are both great goalkeepers. And then pretty much from day one, Raya was the number 1. So if you're Berta in that situation, you would have told Raya on day 1 before you even signed him, you are coming into this football club to be the number 1. And I think that will be a very clear pitch from Berta if he replicates his Atleti style, that number 9, that left winger, and that number 6 will all be told, you're the starting number 6, number 9 and left winger at this football club. So if he can't find that starting position at that number, then he'll have to pivot and do a different approach. But if he does spend whatever that number is in his head for that caliber of player, I don't think it will be a Grealish. Will he, won't he succeed? Is it, isn't it value? Is he going to supplant the player in his position? I think most Arsenal fans will go, yeah, Zubimendi's going to start. Yeah, Sesko, Isak, whoever else are going to start. Yeah, Cunha, Williams, whoever else are going to start. So it's Berta's task to them find them at value. And if he can, I think there'll be a lot to look forward to heading into next season.
Yeah, that's a great point, by the way. And nuances of fate, don't panic. I was just curiously asking about Grealish. I kind of set the chat on fire with that one, Ben. A lot of the listeners are not happy with me, but I am curious. And, listen, they're thinking they have Zinchenko and Jesus PTSD, but at the same time, forget how Jesus and Zinchenko helped elevate and evolve our culture. It's okay to outgrow players, right? But they don't want Chelsea and Manchester City sloppy seconds anymore, unless it's Haaland. Haaland, of course, we'll take him.
Or Rodri.
Listen, they want Lautaro Martinez. They want Eze, and a lot of them want Eze over Nico Williams. They want Isak. They'd rather Gyökeres over Sesko. They feel, and it's exactly what you kind of said. I just found it fascinating. If Berta's like, I'm buying you and you're starting, and knowing that Mikel is stubborn, that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, Simeone's stubborn as well, though. It has to be said.
Yeah,
of course. That's why he did well at Atleti, because he got an indisputable caliber of improvements that Simeone didn't have to debate it or shout and scream. Because if you're Simeone, there's no way you're looking at Julian Alvarez or even Conor Gallagher, who's been a real cult hero there. There's no way that you're looking at those players and saying, I don't want them, I'm not going to use them, I'm not going to start them. So it is a bit different at Arsenal, because the overall squad depth and quality with respect to Atleti is probably bigger. There may be Atleti fans listening to that going, what do you mean? Like, Atleti's just as big a club as Arsenal. And I'm not necessarily talking about only player for player. I'm saying Arsenal are bigger in the sense, regardless of how well the players are performing or their caliber, the wages they're on, the contract lengths that they're on, they're all more imprinted and ingrained into the club. So at Atleti, there is more flexibility because there's urgency for recruitment if you look throughout Berta's time, which is why Atleti had such a big window, and there's flexibility in recruitment because some of the players like Morata, Older, left, Griezmann, gonna go this summer in likelihood, so you can add another one. Whereas the thing about Arsenal is that each of these players, if they get biffed out by a new signing, unlike Atleti, might be on 200k a week, and they might become a bit more unhappy. They might put a bit more pressure on Mikel Arteta. They maybe are all well contracted because obviously before Berta came, you have the sort of flurry of 18 months of contract renewals with a series of Arsenal players, basically ending with Arteta signing his own deal. So all the pitches internally to each of those players, including, for example, Gabriel Martinelli, was about you're the future, you're starters, you're the project, you're here for many, many years. And don't be surprised if Berta comes in and rips up that and says to your Martinelli's, even though we were thinking about starting talks with you, and even though we began that process, maybe we'll change our mind. Maybe you have to earn the right in the next year to go from us discussing another extension to doing it right now. So that's going to be quite an interesting one because I sort of feel like Edu and Arteta were one and the same. They were very in sync. They finish each other's sentences, but in negotiation, they were also very much on the same page. I think what you'll see with Berta is externally him being more maverick and independent from Arteta, and internally him playing the bad cop. So Arteta can still turn around to this so-called project, 6 or 7 of which have been locked in for the next 2 to 5 years. But maybe Berta's going to turn around and go, I'm a fresh pair of eyes here, and I don't care if you signed a new contract in the last 18 months. I'm targeting reinforcements in your position. And if you want to stay at this football club, you have to earn that right on the field, and then we'll talk about extending you further down the line. There's obviously exceptions who already have earned that respect and that need to be rewarded, which is why they're looking at Bukayo Saka's situation. But I think Martinelli is a good example. 6 months ago, Arsenal came to Martinelli and they said, you're here until 2027. It's a relatively recent contract renewal, but there is an appetite to extend you even further. But it wouldn't surprise me if Berta says why. Let's just have him play 2025, 2026. Let's get to the end of 2026. Let's see how many games the guy's playing if he's still at the football club, how many goals he's scoring, how much of a starter he is. Then let's have the contract renewal then with a year and a half left. Why have it with 2.5 years left if you're already looking at that left side and you're wondering whether the guy's going to play that many games? So Berta might put a bit of the brakes on some of these existing talks, and he might rip up a bit of the foundations that Edu's built. And we have to wait and see whether Arteta's on board with that, or it becomes over time a point of constructive debate. And I think the last thing I would say is that everyone kind of thinks in football, manager, sporting director, owners, isn't it great if they're all on the same page? But it's actually really rubbish. And you need this healthy debate and this freedom to challenge. And if you employ too many like-minded people that work well together but don't challenge each other, then eventually you become complacent and not cutthroat enough in the market to really get what you need. So, of course, eventually you want unity, but before you get to that unity, you want a bit of healthy fallout. And I think Berta will be very good at challenging Arteta to make sure that eventually they're on the same page, but not necessarily from day one. And if that happens regularly, and more regularly than between Edu and Arteta, I think that could be a very good thing for the Arsenal project.
And that's a great place to finish. But I agree with you. Like, some of the best projects I've worked on was where we really challenged each other in a room, creatively, strategically, objectively. Nothing gets done by just patting people on the back. And I think maybe there's been too much of nicey nice at Arsenal. and not enough ruthlessness, which I believe Mikel Arteta has. You mentioned Ramsdale and Raya. That was a ruthless situation. He was ruthless with Aubameyang. He was ruthless with Ozil. He's been ruthless at times when maybe feel like it's been unfair. But at the same time, we've wanted ruthlessness, and maybe he's met his match in Berta. And some of the listeners saying what you said, if you think Arteta's stubborn, then, study Diego Simeone.
Yeah.
And that is definitely true. And I think pushing someone, my best bosses were the ones that were so hard on me that I almost broke. But at the same time, I knew that it was for my betterment, to kind of flourish and evolve in my career. And to this day, they're two of my greatest mentors. And I think that, some of the stuff you said there at the end is what Mikel needs. He needs someone breathing down his neck to challenge him and be like, this second. Eventually, we've got to close the deal here. And hopefully he'll see it from a fresh blank canvas perspective. And the same thing, like he has his non-negotiables with players. I think, Andrea Berta should have the same with his transfer strategy at Arsenal, his non-negotiables, and being given the opportunity to really make a difference at the club, which I think he will. This has been an epic show. You've been so generous with your time. You got a yellow card because you showed up late. But let me tell you, the board have looked at the yellow card and VAR is rescinding. Yes, it is. It is being rescinded. So you're lucky there. You're out of the book. Ben, do you promise to come back so we can have another chat once the season is coming to a close to kind of see where we're at with some of these conversations?
I'm always happy to come on and also keep up the good work, because it's so refreshing in the chat and obviously through you on this show to have a frank and honest and in-depth conversation. And, if you listen back, we've spoken about a lot of different things, and it's great to hear everyone's perspective. Because as a journalist, sometimes I feel that we report and we do a lot of what we've done on this show. We hear from different voices and perspectives, but we can't name our sources or the manner in which we've got to a certain story. So it can feel like journalists are just sort of talking to you. And it is equally as important to listen to fan views, opinions, criticism of our own work or of projects, and hear different perspectives, like we were talking about with Saudi Arabia too. So I love coming on these shows, and I love being a part of passionate fan-led content. So thanks for having me, and keep up.
It's lovely. Work. Thanks so much. Because a lot of the times when you kind of go on BBC or it's like 15 minutes, right? Whereas here we're really able to hear, and you tell a really good kind of narrative, the way you project your narrative and stuff. It's very interesting. I love learning from my guests, and I'm a sponge when it comes to, learning and being open to different things too. So I really appreciate what you're saying. They're absolutely loving you in the chat. And we really appreciate your time, and we'll definitely hook up later on in the season, and we'll revisit these stories as well. Really good stuff. And Saskia Guna, there's always someone. I know, we're just having fun. Couldn't give him an outright red, could I? So yeah. All right, we'll be back tomorrow.
What you got to do? You got to wave the second yellow now, then wave the red. Then it will be a red card. Then it can go to VAR, and then the red card can be rescinded.
Oh my goodness! See what they've done to us in football. Unbelievable. Thanks a lot. You can find Ben now. Let's just make sure, because I know you're doing the TalkSport commentary. You're the senior writer over at Give Me Sport. What else are you doing? Let everyone know what's coming up, where they can find your stuff if it's not here.
Yeah, TalkSport, weekly Premier League commentary and general reporter on various things. So hopefully in for a busy few weeks. Man City verdict maybe within the next weeks or month. I've got Gimme Sport, as you mentioned, which houses a lot of my transfer news. And there's a brand new podcast that we've launched as well. Myself, Joel Bayer, Olivia Bazaglo, and Fabrizio Romano. Joel Bayer, remember, is an Arsenal fan. He makes no secret of that. So that's called Market Madness. We're only 10 shows in, but really enjoying that. So give it a listen if you can.
With Fabrizio. So you and Romano on the same podcast. You're going to break the
Romano,
internet.
Olivia, and Joel. There's actually more
Brilliant.
friction to transfer reporters, but huge respect for Romano. So I never would claim to be competing with his greatness, but there's more friction between Joel and Olivia because they're Chelsea and Arsenal fans.
I love it. Are you a Gooner? Someone's just asking me.
No, I'm Leicester.
No?
As per, if you look very closely,
my friend
I know there's
Martin
Messi
Rogers
on one side of the screen, but if you look on the other screen, that is Claudio Ranieri kissing the Premier League trophy for Leicester, born and bred in Leicester. And as Arsenal fans will know, one of the greatest Premier League moments was at the old Filbert Street, the Bergkamp hat-trick. But what people sometimes forget is after he scored that outrageous third, Leicester went up the other end and equalised.
I tell you, that moment, that Welbeck header, I thought that was going to be it. The Ozil corner to Welbeck, I thought we were going to win the league, and somehow, what a great story though. What a moment for you. That's a whole other show to get stuck into. My good friend Martin Rogers, who wrote for the Mirror and Yahoo and USA Today, and is now, I think, over at The Athletic, is a Leicester fan. So I got to see it through his eyes, and yeah, magical. It's our turn next. Come on. Gotta
I've got
be
high
Arsenal
hopes
next.
for Arsenal. And you know what? Like, the most interesting thing for Arsenal for me is Mikel Arteta has had this project, right? And everyone's sort of accepted, whether rightly or wrongly, that 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, get better, get better, get better, get better, compete, get close. That's sort of been the vibe, right? And only now maybe are people saying, well, it can't keep being 5 years, 7 years, 9 years, 12 years. But if you're putting together a job description for Berta, because he's coming in to a 5-year project, not day 1, day 2, year 1, year 3, like Arteta, the brief for Berta has to be, this is about a silverware winning project. Whereas for day 1 for Arteta, it was about, you got to get in a position to compete. And then from there, year on year on year, you challenge for silverware. Now I think Arsenal will succeed because Berta isn't going, how can I work with Arteta on this project? Berta's going, I'm hired into a developed project. And from day 1, Berta's mentality should be silverware, silverware, silverware. Whereas Arteta's mentality when it was day 1 is build, 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 youth, 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 compete, compete, compete. I think there's one word on Berta's mind, and it's silverware. And that's why I've got, speaking as a neutral and as a Leicester fan with no skin in the game if I take off my journalist hat. But I think that we will see Arsenal make a step up under Berta and finally and consistently start winning some silverware. And I hope so, because it's a great club.
Thank you. We appreciate that and appreciate you. And there have been some other really good questions. We're going to get Ben back on the show, and I promise that I'll ask them, including whether or not the media like Mikel. We'll dive into that another day. A lot of them curious on that. And Ben, thank you again. Keep up the great work, and we look forward to chatting with you soon. Squaddies, I'll be back tomorrow at 5 o'clock with Harry Symeou for a SWOT analysis. Please share this show with your friends. It's a long one, but it is a good one, and it's stacked with excellent narrative from Mr. Ben Jacobs. Until tomorrow at E Squaddies, don't forget to tell your loved ones you love them, and have a great night.
Mind the gap between the train and the platform. Please stand clear of the discussion doors. The next stop is Highbury Squad.
And don't forget, on Friday, we have Potsy, and we also have the final result on Newman and his Zenith coin. See you tomorrow at 5 with Harry.